Lee Inherits Slaves by Douglas Southall Freeman. Excerpt from Robert E. Lee by Douglas Southall Freeman. On November 11th, 1857, Robert E. Lee reached Arlington on the saddest of all his antebellum homecomings. The shadow of Mr. Custis's death still hung over the plantation. The old gentleman had been ill only 4 days from pneumonia when he had realized that his end was near at hand. On the morning of October 10th, after having been unconscious most of the night, Mr. Custis had roused himself, had embraced Mrs. Lee and the children, and had directed that his rector be summoned. After the clergyman had arrived, Mr. Custis had asked that the prayer for the dying be said, and while it was being repeated, he passed away. He was then in his 77th year. The absence of his father-in-law, however, was less of a shock to Lee than the plight of his wife. When he had left home in 1856, she had been in her usual health, which had been fair after she had recovered from the pelvic infection which, in 1836, had caused her so much suffering. Lee had heard in January 1857 that she was ill, and he had yielded at that time to his impulse to give advice, but he does not seem to have realized the seriousness of her condition. Perhaps she kept it from him, lest it add unhappiness to the hardships he had to sustain in Texas. "I almost dread him seeing my crippled state," she had written in February 1857 to a kinswoman. Arthritis had assailed her right hand and arm at that time, and probably was slowly spreading. Often she was kept awake at night by the pain. Lee now found her scarcely able to move about the house, and though she was only 49, aging very rapidly. Overnight, and without warning, he had to face the fact that his wife had become an invalid. That was enough to add the deepest gloom to his return. Lee soon found that Mr. Custis's will had put a heavy burden on him. He had been named one of the 4 executors, and as the others failed to qualify, he had to discharge all the duties of settling a troublesome estate under a complicated testament. Mr. Custis had drawn up the paper in 1855, apparently without consulting counsel. He left Mrs. Lee a life interest in Arlington and its contents and in adjacent properties. On her demise, all this property, except the minor plate, was to pass in fee to Custis Lee, he, my eldest grandson, taking my name in arms. His White House plantation of 4,000 acres in New Kent County, Mr. Custis left to Rooney Lee, and the Romancock property of like acreage he bequeathed to his youngest grandson, Robert E. Lee, Jr. To Colonel Lee, he left a lot in Square 21 of Washington City. Each of Mr. Custis's granddaughters was to receive $10,000. One paragraph of the will provided that Smith's Island, off Northampton County, and sundry lands in Stratford, Richmond, and Westmoreland counties should be sold to provide these legacies. Another section said that these properties and my estates of the White House in the county of New Kent and Romancock in the county of King William were to be charged with the payment of the legacies to my granddaughters. The will then read, Smith's Island and the aforesaid lands in Stafford, Richmond, and Westmoreland only are to be sold, the lands of the White House and Romancock to be worked to raise the aforesaid legacies to my 4 granddaughters. This was confusing and contradictory enough, but a final tangle was added by a provision that when the legacies should have been paid and the properties had been cleared of debt, all the Custis slaves were to be emancipated. The said emancipation to be accomplished in not exceeding 5 years from the time of my decease. The courts manifestly would be required to construe this document and to determine the nature and extent of the liens on White House and Romancock. The beneficiaries under the will were of the same family. If therefore all went well and the miscellaneous landed properties yielded enough to pay the greater part of the legacies without draining the White House and Romancock for too long a time, A settlement would be a matter of no great difficulty. The immediate trouble was that Mr. Custis left more than $10,000 of debts and virtually no money with which to operate the estate. He had wide spreading acres and 196 slaves, but he had always been a negligent farmer and an easy-going master, and he had become more careless as he had grown older. For some time after 1851, he had devoted himself chiefly to the painting of feeble pictures of Washington's battles. His Arlington tract of 1,100 acres in the Virginia phrase was sadly run down. His fences had fallen, his roof leaked, his very lawn was being invaded by bushes and weeds. Arlington would not have sustained the family during the life of Mr. Custis had he not received a fair income from some of his other farms that were rented out to capable planters. His servants, who for years had done little but tend their own gardens, were not disposed to turn to hard work. Instead of inheriting easy luxury, the Lees found themselves land poor. As executor, Lee saw that if his daughter's legacies were to be paid, Arlington must be made self supporting. If the house was to be saved from ruin, it had to be repaired. To do all this called for the expenditure of at least a part of his salary and also for his presence on the ground. He could not hope to effect the necessary revolution through someone else while he was absent in Texas. Embarrassing as was the application, and serious as might be the effect on his career of protracted separation from his regiment, he had no choice except to ask for a lengthy leave of absence. He applied for 2 months' leave soon after he reached home, and before that expired he got an extension to December 1st, 1858, by which time he hoped to be able to rejoin his regiment. In all this, of course, he had the support of his true and warm friend, as he styled General Scott. It had been only in the previous spring that his old chief had advocated a commission for Rooney Lee, mainly, as Scott had said, on the extraordinary merits of the father, the very best soldier I ever saw in the field. As commanding general of the army, Scott would grant whatever leave the circumstances of Colonel Lee required, and would be ready to argue that it was far less than the country owed Lee. So Lee settled down in the winter of 1857 to 58 to become temporarily a farmer with scant equipment, little money, many debts, and indifferent help. He had often longed to lead the life of a planter, but now that he had to do so with a neglected estate, deeply involved, he entered upon one of the darkest, most unhappy periods of his life. He wished, of course, for Mrs. Lee and the children to be comfortable, and he wanted the property to be in good order when it passed to his son. But he could do little at that season for the repair of the house or for the cultivation of the farm. He soon became restless and unsettled regarding his future. He felt that he was at the crossroads. Should he stay in the army, or was it his duty to resign and devote himself to Arlington, on which $10,000, exclusive of the payment of his debts, would have to be spent? He decided that his course of action should depend chiefly on what his sons had in contemplation. Custis was still in the West, and not particularly pleased with his post. Rooney wanted to marry his cousin, Charlotte Wickham of Shirley, and start housekeeping at White House. But he had just been ordered to join the expedition sent against the Mormons, and he could not afford to resign at such a time. Lee explained all this in a letter to Custis, and continued, "As to myself and future plans, I shall defer my determination until the fall, and it will not be necessary to determine till then. In the meantime, you must think over the matter and decide what you would prefer doing. If you wish to resign and take this place, and Rooney to get married and settle down at the White House, there would be no necessity for my leaving the army. I had thought myself of applying for your appointment in any new regiment that might be raised this winter, if I saw any chance of success, and am glad you have mentioned the subject. I am doubtful whether you would be benefited or not. That also depends upon your taste and feelings. The service in the engineer corps is preferable to that in the regiment. No place is without its drawbacks, and you must not expect unalloyed pleasure anywhere. Promotion, if offered an officer, ought, in my opinion, to be accepted, but it need not be sought unless deserved. A captaincy in the engineers in time of peace, in responsibility, dignity, and usefulness, would rank with a field officer of the line. In time of war, it might be different. There was, in this letter, a suggestion of his strong wish to remain in the army, and perhaps an indirect confession that his former service with the engineers was preferable to his new cavalry command, but desire and ambition alike were subordinated to the need of the family. He was not alone in this. If he was willing to abandon his profession in order to improve Arlington for his son, Custis was equally anxious to increase his father's happiness and at his own expense. On March 17, 1858, Lee received a letter from Custis, written February 18th, in which the boy sent his father a deed to Arlington and all the other property inherited under his grandfather's will. The transfer had already been suggested by Custis, so it was no surprise to the senior Lee. He sat down at once and thanked his son, but of course declined the gift. He said, I am deeply impressed by your filial feeling of love and consideration, as well as your tender solicitude for me, of which, however, I required no proof, and am equally touched by your generosity and disinterestedness. But from what I said in a previous letter, you will not be surprised at my repeating that I cannot accept your offer. It is not from an unwillingness to receive from you a gift you think proper to bestow, or to be indebted to you for any benefit great or small, but simply because it would not be right for me to do so. Your dear grandfather distributed his property as he thought best, and it is proper that it should remain as he bestowed it. It will not prevent me from improving it to the best of my ability, or of making it as comfortable a home for your mother, sisters, and yourself as I can. I only wish I could do more than I shall have it in my power to do. I wish you had received my previous letter on this subject in time to have saved you the trouble of executing the deed you transmitted me. Here, Lee's amusing propensity for giving advice to his children asserted itself even more strongly, and certainly with less of tact than usually. He added, and indeed, I also regret the expense you incurred, which I fear in that country is considerable, and I wish you to save all your money and invest it in some safe and lucrative way, that you may have the means to build up old Arlington and make it all we would wish to see it. The necessity I daily have for money has, I fear, made me parsimonious. In order that you may know the full extent of your grandfather's will, I enclose you a copy. Custis probably was actuated by a desire to have his father own a property on which he, and not the son, would have to spend money. Lee must have felt that his boy's generous letter, which unfortunately has been lost, was full compensation for all the labor he put on Arlington. His own affairs, however, were not so embarrassed as Custis may have thought. The Custis property was in distress, but Lee himself had always lived within his income and had been able to save a part of his salary. Lee's leave was to expire on December 1st, 1858, but as that date approached, Lee realized that he could not quit Arlington with his work as executor half done. The farm was by no means in the order he desired. Moreover, the court had not yet construed those parts of Mr. Custis's will in which provision had been made both for the emancipation and for the employment of the slaves on the farms, as well as for the sale of certain properties, to provide the specified bequests for the daughters. Lee set forth his situation very fully in a letter of October 22, 1858, addressed to General Scott's Assistant Adjutant General. This read as follows: I have been occupied ever since my arrival from Texas in settling the estate of the late G. W. P. Custis, and have earnestly endeavored so to arrange it so as to enable me to return to my regiment this fall. I find it, however, impossible to do so, and without going into a narration of matters still unfinished and requiring my personal attention, I will only state that the terms of Mr. Custis's will are found to be so indefinite and admit of so many different versions that I have been compelled to apply to the Circuit Court of Virginia for their true and legal construction and specific rules from my government as executor. These I had hoped to receive before this time, but the earliest period I can now obtain them is at the next November term of said court, which, if received, will not enable me to put in train of execution before the expiration of my present leave of absence, 1st December. The most important point to be determined by the court is the period of the emancipation of the slaves, which is dependent upon the conditions of the will. Justice to them requires their earliest fulfillment. I therefore feel compelled to ask an extension of my present leave of absence till 1st May next. The leave of absence granted by the Command General of the Department of Texas authorized me to ask for such an extension as was necessary for the arrangement of my business. Should, however, the Commanding General of the Army consider my presence with my regiment this winter necessary, I will cheerfully join at any time he may designate. Scott heartily approved this application, which was accordingly granted. Not all this additional leave, however, was spent at home. On December 15th, Lee was at West Point, sitting on an irksome court of inquiry assembled to hear some foolish charges against Professor Mahan. This held him until after Christmas, and forced him to hurry back home for the necessary but unpleasant task of hiring out some of the idle Arlington Negroes. The only pleasure Lee had on this journey was the report of Rooney's soldierly bearing and good conduct given him in New York by Rooney's Colonel, Charles A. May. The winter of 1858 59 and the spring of 1859 were in many ways the gloomiest Lee had experienced. The Circuit Court adjourned in November 1858 without construing the Custis will, and the pressure on Lee's finances for the improvement of the property was so manifest that the always thoughtful Mrs. Fitzhugh had constrained to send him $1,000 to be used as he saw fit. Lee had determined to keep the expenditures at Arlington within his means, and he could not accept the check, which he acknowledged with warmest gratitude. Remaining continuously at home, except for about 7 weeks' service on a board convened in Washington to consider the equipment of the cavalry, he worked hard, but, as he thought, to very little purpose. He got the house and the stable safe from leaks, and, as he said, ameliorated some things, but the embarrassment of limited means could not be overcome. The improvements, he wrote Custis, were very meager. I have been able to do nothing to the grounds around the house, except to clean up on the hill, and have been obliged to limit myself to what is most essential and promises something for man and beast to eat, and to furnish shelter and protection. You will find things, therefore, I fear, rough and unsightly, as much as I desire to polish up your mother's habitation and to prepare for you an acceptable home. His other worries continued. Mrs. Lee's health at the end of the spring of 1859 was as bad as it had been when Lee returned from Texas. By July, Lee had begun to despair of her recovery. His ailing daughters, except Mildred, got no better. I have no enjoyment in life now, he wrote in distress, but what I derive from my children. He did not spare himself to make those young Lees happy. Whatever the load he carried, he had a cheerful mien in their presence. Once, in the autumn of 1858, he came upon Annie and Catherine Stiles, a friend from Georgia, weeping together as Catherine made ready to leave after a visit. No tears at Arlington, he gaily told them, no tears. But time was not far distant when there would be nothing but tears at Arlington. Lee's only relief from nursing his family and managing the farm in 1859 was in a number of brief visits. In March he traveled to Richmond, and thence to Shirley, the beloved old home of his mother, where on the 23rd Rooney was married to his distant cousin, Charlotte Wickham. The wedding was of the generous, old-fashioned sort, where the guests lingered long. Lee was one of the trustees under the generous marriage settlement of Charlotte, and on April 1st he was in Richmond, probably in connection with the recordation of the deed of trust. The next month, Lee made a brief trip to Goodwood, his first vacation since his return to Virginia. He went also to the White House at the end of May to prepare it for Rooney and Charlotte, who were soon to move there, and he journeyed to Baltimore in July to see Mrs. Marshall, whose eyesight was endangered. But even changes of scene, which he regarded as the best physic, did not raise his depressed spirits. Absence from his command troubled him deeply, the more so as circumstances had protracted it. He had hoped to return to his regiment on May 1st, for the summer at least, but he had to ask once again that his leave be prolonged, and on June 14th had it extended 4 months more. He explained this to Custis. It was this desire to have Robert with me, the unsettled business of your grandpa's estate, your mamma's condition, and the hope I at one time entertained of seeing you, my dear son, that induced me to forego my purpose of returning to Texas this summer and to remain till the fall. God knows whether I have done right or whether my stay will be an advantage. I am very doubtful on the subject and feel that I ought to be with my regiment, and this feeling deprives me of half the pleasure I should derive from being here under other circumstances. The handling of the slaves, always a difficult matter to a conscientious man, added to Lee's distress. The Negroes at Arlington numbered 63, and the majority of them belonged to a few large families. They were more than Lee could work advantageously with his available capital and land. Consequently, he had to hire out a few of them by the year in order to supplement the income from the property. The demand for servants was so limited in Northern Virginia and the return was so small that he was compelled to send some of the Arlington Negroes to work in Eastern Virginia. This may have caused something of a rebellion among them, for two of them, a man and a young woman, ran away in the hope of reaching Pennsylvania. They were captured in Maryland and were returned to Arlington. Thereupon, Lee sent them to labor in Lower Virginia, where there would be less danger of their absconding. That probably was the extent of the punishment imposed on them. There is no evidence, direct or indirect, that Lee ever had them or any other Negroes flogged. The usage at Arlington and elsewhere in Virginia among people of Lee's station forbade such a thing, but false stories were spread, and on June 24th, 1859, the New York Tribune printed two communications on the affair. One of them read as follows: Some facts that should come to light. To the editor of the New York Tribune. Sir, it is known that the Venerable George Washington Parke Custis died some 2 years ago, and the same papers that announced his death announced also the fact that on his deathbed he liberated his slaves. The will, for some reason, was never allowed any publicity, and the slaves themselves were cajoled along with the idea that some slight necessary arrangements were to be made when they would all have their free papers. Finally, they were told 5 years must elapse before they could go. Meantime, they have been deprived of all means of making a little now and then for themselves, as they were allowed to do during Mr. Custis's life, and have been kept harder at work than ever, and part of the time have been cut down to half a peck of unsifted meal a week for each person, without even their fish allowance. 3 old women, who have seen nearly their century each, are kept sewing, making clothes for the field hands from daylight till dark, with nothing but a half peck of meal to eat, no tea or coffee, nothing that old people crave, and no time given them to earn these little rarities, as formerly. One old man, 80 years old, bent with age, and whom Mr. Custis had long since told had done enough and might go home and smoke his pipe in peace, is now turned out as a regular field hand. A year ago, for some trifling offense, 3 were sent to jail, and a few months later 3 more, for simply going down to the river to get themselves some fish, when they were literally starved. Some 3 or 4 weeks ago, 3, more courageous than the rest, thinking their 5 years would never come to an end, came to the conclusion to leave for the North. They were most valuable servants, but they were never advertised, and there was no effort made to regain them, which looks exceedingly as though Mr. Lee, the present proprietor, knew he had no lawful claims to them. They had not proceeded far before their progress was intercepted by some brute in human form who suspected them to be fugitives and probably wished a reward. They were lodged in jail and frightened into telling where they started from. Mr. Lee was forthwith acquainted with their whereabouts when they were transported back, taken into a barn, stripped, and the men received 39 lashes each from the hands of the slave whipper when he refused to whip the girl, and Mr. Lee himself administered the 39 lashes to her. They were then sent to Richmond jail, where they are now lodged. Next to Mount Vernon, we associate the Custis place with the father of this free country. Shall Washington's bodyguard be thus tampered with, and never a voice raised for such utter helplessness? A. Washington, June 21st, 1859. The other letter was briefer, but equally exaggerated. To the editor of the New York Tribune: Sir, I live 1 mile from the plantation of George Washington P. Custis, now Colonel Lee's, as Custis willed it to Lee. All the slaves on the estate, as I understand, were set free at the death of Custis, but are now held in bondage by Lee. I have inquired concerning the will, but can get no satisfaction. Custis had 15 children by his slave women. I see his grandchildren every day. They are of a dark yellow. Last week, 3 of the slaves ran away. An officer was sent after them, overtook them 9 miles this side of Pennsylvania, and brought them back. Colonel Lee ordered them whipped. There were 2 men and 1 woman. The officer whipped the 2 men, and said he could not whip the woman, and Colonel Lee stripped her and whipped her himself. These are the facts, as I learn from near relatives of the men whipped. After being whipped, he sent them to Richmond and hired them out as good farm hands. Yours, A. Citizen. Washington, June 19th, 1859. This was Lee's first experience with the extravagance of irresponsible anti-slavery agitators. The libel, which was to be reprinted many times in later years with new embellishments, made him unhappy, but it did not lead him to any violent retort. All he had to say to Custis about the criticism was, "The New York Tribune has attacked me for my treatment of your grandfather's slaves, but I shall not reply. He has left me an unpleasant legacy.